He thought she was invisible, just another quiet figure in the background, but within minutes, she would remind everyone in that room what true mastery sounded like. The grand recital hall of the Harrington Music Conservatory shimmered under cascading crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished marble floors that echoed softly beneath the heels of elegantly dressed guests. The air carried a low hum of anticipation, refined laughter blending with the delicate tuning of instruments backstage. Tonight's performance was not just another recital, it was a statement, headlined by the legendary Maestro Victor Laurent, a man whose reputation alone could silence a room before a single note was played. His name carried weight, prestige, and an unspoken warning to anyone who dared fall short of excellence. And yet, just beyond the velvet curtains, moving almost unnoticed through the narrow backstage corridors, was Emily Carter, dressed in a simple navy blouse and worn flats. Her presence barely registered among the staff bustling around her. She adjusted sheet music, aligned chairs, and checked the piano bench with quiet precision. Her movements efficient, deliberate, invisible. To most, she was just another assistant, someone who existed on the edges of greatness but never within it, a woman whose life seemed defined by staying out of the spotlight. But what none of them knew, what none of them even considered worth asking, was that Emily had once stood where the spotlight now waited, years ago, under brighter lights, in rooms even grander than this one. Her hands had commanded applause that lasted minutes, not seconds. Her name had once been whispered with awe, and then, just as suddenly, it had disappeared, replaced by silence, by absence, by a choice she had never explained. Back in the present, the audience settled into their seats, a sea of expectation rippling through the hall as the program began. Victor Laurent stood at the edge of the stage, his tailored black suit immaculate, his posture unyielding, scanning the room with the practiced confidence of a man who knew he owned it. Every detail had to be perfect, every performer flawless, because anything less would reflect on him, and Victor Laurent did not tolerate imperfection. A stage manager rushed toward him, whispering urgently, her voice tight with concern. Something was wrong. The scheduled pianist, the evening centerpiece, had fallen ill just minutes before the performance. The news hung in the air like a crack in glass, invisible at first but spreading fast. Victor's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly as calculations raced through his mind. Canceling was not an option, postponing was unthinkable. The audience outside expected brilliance, and failure was not a word in his vocabulary. His gaze swept across the backstage area, dismissive, searching, until it landed, briefly, almost accidentally, on Emily, who stood quietly by the piano, adjusting the sheet music with calm, steady hands. For a moment, something unreadable flickered in his expression, then it was gone, replaced by something colder, more calculated. He exhaled slowly, a decision forming, one that to him felt less like risk and more like amusement. And as the murmur of the audience grew louder beyond the curtains, the stage lights dimmed slightly, waiting, the hall holding its breath, unaware that what was about to unfold would not just save the performance, but rewrite everything they thought they understood about talent, status, and the quiet woman no one had bothered to see. Victor Laurent did not look at Emily as a person, he looked at her as a solution, temporary, expendable, and entirely beneath the standard he had spent decades building. Yet in that moment, she was the only option standing between him and public embarrassment. He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor, his presence alone causing nearby staff to straighten instantly. Emily sensed him before he spoke, her hands pausing for just a fraction of a second on the piano lid, though her posture remained composed. "You," he said, his tone measured but unmistakably dismissive, as if addressing someone whose name was not worth remembering. "You are familiar enough with the instrument to follow sheet music, correct?" The question was not really a question, it was an assumption. Wrapped in condescension, Emily lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes for the briefest moment, her expression calm, almost unreadable. "I can manage," she replied quietly, her voice soft but steady. Victor exhaled through his nose, unimpressed. "Good," he said, already turning slightly as if the conversation had ended before it began. "You will go on stage and play the opening piece, nothing ambitious, just enough to fill time while we reorganize the program." Behind him, a few younger musicians exchanged glances, their raised eyebrows barely concealing their skepticism. One of them leaned toward another and whispered, "This is going to be painful to watch." A faint ripple of suppressed laughter followed, quickly silenced when Victor glanced back, not out of respect for Emily, but for him. Emily heard it, of course she did, every word, every assumption, every quiet judgment that filled the air heavier than the music itself, but her face did not change, she simply nodded once. A small, controlled motion that revealed nothing of what stirred beneath the surface. Victor continued, his voice lowering slightly, though still sharp, do not overthink it, stay within your limits, we are not expecting excellence, only competence. The words lingered, deliberate, precise, designed to define her place before she even touched a single key, and yet, there was something in the way Emily absorbed them, not defensive, not submissive, but almost patient, as though she had heard far worse and learned long ago that responses were unnecessary, actions would speak when the time came. The stage manager hurried over, pressing a folded program into Emily's hands, her fingers trembling slightly as she explained the sequence, but Emily barely glanced at it, her attention drifting instead to the piano just beyond the curtain. The black Steinway grand sat under a focused beam of light, waiting, silent, its polished surface reflecting fragments of the empty stage like a mirror of possibility. Victor adjusted his cufflinks, regaining his composure as he prepared to address the audience, already crafting the narrative he would present. A minor adjustment, an unexpected change, nothing that would diminish the evening's prestige, because in his mind, nothing could, not even the quiet woman he had just placed at the center of it. He stepped toward the curtain, pausing only briefly as he added, almost as an afterthought, and try not to make it memorable. The words fell with a quiet finality, a subtle command to remain forgettable, to blend back into obscurity the moment it was over. Emily watched him walk away, her fingers gently brushing the edge of the piano bench as if reacquainting herself with something deeply familiar, something she had not truly left behind. The murmur of the audience swelled again as Victor's voice echoed onto the stage, smooth and commanding, introducing the unexpected opening, and for a brief moment, just before her name was called, Emily closed her eyes, not in hesitation, but in recognition, as if stepping not into something new, but into something she had always carried within her, waiting, quiet, patient, and finally, ready. The applause that greeted Victor's voice was polite, expectant, unaware of the quiet shift about to take place behind the curtain. As Emily stepped forward when her name was called, the sound of it felt unfamiliar in that space, almost out of place against the polished reputation of the evening. A few audience members glanced at their programs, brows furrowing slightly as they searched for a name that was not printed there. Confusion flickered, followed quickly by mild curiosity. She walked with measured steps onto the stage, neither rushed nor hesitant. The soft echo of her shoes against the wood carried farther than expected, amplified by the hush that naturally fell over the room when something unexpected interrupted routine. Victor stood off to the side, arms loosely crossed, his expression composed but distant, watching not with interest, but with quiet skepticism, as if waiting for confirmation of what he already believed, that this would be forgettable, that this would pass. Quickly, Emily reached the piano and paused, not for effect, but for alignment, her hand resting lightly on the curved edge of the instrument, the polished surface cool beneath her fingertips. The Steinway sat there like an old memory, familiar in a way that could not be explained to anyone watching. She adjusted the bench with a small, precise movement, the faint scrape barely audible, then sat, her posture naturally straight, not rehearsed, not forced, simply ingrained. In the audience, a man in the third row leaned slightly toward his companion and whispered, "This must be some kind of last-minute filler." The woman beside him nodded faintly, her attention already drifting, assuming this moment would be something to endure rather than remember. Backstage, one of the younger pianists folded his arms, shaking his head almost imperceptibly, his lips pressing into a thin line as if bracing for disappointment. Emily placed her hands in her lap for a brief second, her fingers still, her breathing even. The room seemed to expand and contract in that silence, as if time itself hesitated, waiting. Then she lifted her hands, hovering just above the keys, not touching them yet, a subtle pause that went unnoticed by most, but to those who truly understood music, it was something else entirely. It was control, it was intention. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of curiosity slipping through his otherwise guarded demeanor. Something about that stillness did not match the narrative he had assigned her. It did not feel uncertain, it did not feel accidental, it felt deliberate. The kind of pause that belonged to someone who knew exactly what would come next. Emily's fingers descended, and the first note rang out, clear, resonant, carrying through the hall with a purity that cut through the lingering assumptions like light through glass. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was precise, impossibly precise, the kind of tone that could not be faked, could not be stumbled into. It had to be placed, chosen, understood. The second note followed, then the third, forming a phrase that unfolded with quiet confidence. Not rushed, not tentative, but certain. The murmur that had hovered at the edges of the room dissolved, replaced by a subtle shift in attention. People who had been leaning back in their seats began to straighten. Conversations that had not fully ended now did. Completely. The man in the third row stopped mid-whisper, his mouth closing as his eyes fixed on the stage. Victor's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his arms lowering slightly, his gaze sharpening, something unfamiliar creeping into his expression, not yet recognition, but the absence of dismissal. Emily did not look up, she did not acknowledge the room. Her world had narrowed to the keys beneath her fingers, each movement flowing into the next with an ease that suggested not effort, but memory, as if the music was not being performed, but remembered. And as the melody began to take shape, something deeper stirred beneath the surface, something that hinted that this was no simple substitution, no temporary solution. This was the beginning of something none of them had prepared for, and the room, whether it realized it or not, had already begun to listen differently. The melody did not rush to impress, it unfolded with a quiet authority that demanded attention rather than begging for it, each note placed with intention, each phrase breathing with a natural rhythm that felt less like performance and more like truth, the kind of truth that could not be taught in classrooms or perfected through repetition alone. It had to be lived, and as Emily's hands moved across the keys, that truth became impossible to ignore. The audience, once restless with polite expectation, now leaned forward almost in unison, as if pulled by something they could not quite explain. The air in the hall shifted, heavier, more focused. Conversation ceased entirely, replaced by a silence that was no longer casual but absolute, the kind of silence that forms only when something real begins to happen. Victor felt it too, though he would never have admitted it in that moment. His eyes narrowed further. Not in judgment now, but in calculation. Something was not aligning with his assumptions. The phrasing was too refined, the dynamics too controlled. There was no hesitation, no searching, only certainty. And certainty at that level did not belong to someone who merely managed, it belonged to someone who understood, deeply, intimately. He took a step closer to the edge of the stage, almost unconsciously, his posture no longer relaxed, his attention no longer divided. Backstage, the young pianists who had whispered moments earlier now stood still, their skepticism dissolving into something quieter, something closer to unease. One of them shifted his weight slightly, his arms slowly uncrossing as his focus sharpened. Emily continued, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady on the keys, her fingers moving with a fluid precision that suggested not effort, but memory, as if the instrument itself recognized her, responding in kind. The melody deepened, weaving complexity into simplicity, subtle variations that only trained ears would catch, but powerful enough that even those without formal knowledge could feel the difference. It was no longer background music. It was presence, undeniable. The man in the third row who had once dismissed her now sat completely still, his earlier assumption forgotten, replaced by a growing awareness that something unexpected was unfolding in front of him. Beside him, the woman who had nodded in agreement now watched with widened eyes, her posture straight, her attention fully captured. Victor's jaw tightened slightly, not out of anger, but out of recognition that something was slipping beyond his control. The narrative he had constructed, the simple explanation he had assigned to this moment, it was no longer holding. Emily transitioned into a more demanding passage, her hands crossing seamlessly, her timing exact, her touch balanced between strength and restraint. It was the kind of passage that exposed flaws instantly, that revealed the difference between competence and mastery within seconds. And yet, there were no cracks, no hesitation, only clarity, only command. A quiet realization began to settle over the room, subtle at first, then undeniable. This was not luck, this was not improvisation, this was skill, refined and deliberate. Victor's breath slowed, his mind racing through fragments of memory. Performances he had witnessed, names he had studied, moments that had carried this same weight. this same unmistakable presence, and for the first time since the music began, something close to uncertainty flickered across his face. Emily did not acknowledge it, she did not look up, she did not seek validation, her world remained anchored to the instrument, to the language she spoke without words, and as the piece built toward its next movement, the entire hall seemed to lean into it, suspended between what they thought they knew and what they were beginning to understand, and in that fragile space, where perception begins to shift and certainty begins to crack, the truth was already emerging, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The music no longer belonged to the program, it no longer served as a temporary solution or a quiet filler between acts, it had taken control of the room entirely, shaping the air, commanding attention with a presence that could not be interrupted, and as Emily moved deeper into the piece, the subtle elegance of her playing transformed into something more powerful, more undeniable. Her fingers accelerated with precision, not hurried but intentional, weaving through complex passages that demanded both technical mastery and emotional restraint, and she delivered both with an ease that felt almost effortless, the kind of effortlessness that only comes from years of discipline hidden beneath silence. The audience felt it before they understood it, a rising tension that pulled them forward in their seats, breaths held without realizing it, eyes fixed not just on the stage, but on her hands, on the way each note seemed to land exactly where it belonged, no more, no less. Victor stood completely still now, the casual distance he had maintained earlier gone, replaced by a focused stillness that bordered on disbelief, his mind no longer searching for flaws, but searching for answers, because what he was hearing did not align with the narrative he had created, it did not fit within the limits he had assigned to her, and yet it was happening, unfolding in real time, undeniable. He took another step closer, barely aware of the movement, his attention narrowing further, his memory reaching back through years of performances, competitions, recordings, searching for a reference point, for something familiar in the phrasing, in the subtle articulation of each passage. There was something there, something he had heard before, but the connection remained just out of reach, like a name on the edge of recall. Backstage, the younger musicians no longer whispered, they watched in complete silence, their earlier skepticism replaced by something heavier, something closer to humility. One of them slowly lowered his gaze, as if realizing that what he had dismissed moments ago was now redefining the very standard he aspired to reach. Emily transitioned into a section that demanded complete control, delicate yet unforgiving, where even the smallest misstep would shatter the illusion, but there was no misstep, only clarity. Her touch softened, drawing the sound inward, creating a moment so intimate that the vast hall felt smaller, closer, as if every listener had been pulled into the same quiet space, the kind of space where truth becomes unavoidable. The man in the third row felt his chest tighten slightly, not from discomfort, but from recognition, a realization that he had judged too quickly, that he had reduced something extraordinary into something ordinary without ever giving it a chance to reveal itself. Beside him, the woman who had once nodded in dismissal now sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes reflecting something closer to awe. Victor's expression shifted again. The certainty that had once defined him now replaced by something unfamiliar, something quieter, respect, not given freely, but drawn out of him by something he could not deny. And as the music continued to build, rising toward a peak that felt both inevitable and completely unpredictable, the room followed, every person inside it now fully aware that they were witnessing something rare, something that could not be replicated or rehearsed, something that existed only in this moment, carried by the quiet woman they had failed to see. And as Emily's hands moved toward the final movement of the piece, the energy in the hall reached a point where even silence felt loud, where anticipation itself became a presence, and in that charged stillness, one truth stood clear: she had never been out of place, they had simply failed to recognize where she truly belonged. The final movement approached not with chaos, but with a quiet inevitability, as if the music itself had been building toward this moment long before anyone in that room had taken their seat. Emily's hands moved with a confidence that no longer needed to prove anything, every transition seamless, every dynamic shift intentional. The complexity of the composition unfolded beneath her fingers like a story she had told countless times before, yet somehow, in this moment, it felt entirely new. The tempo increased, not rushed, but alive, carrying a pulse that resonated through the hall, through the audience, through Victor himself, who now stood at the edge of the stage, no longer observing, but listening, truly listening, his earlier assumptions now distant, almost irrelevant, replaced by a growing realization that what he was witnessing could not be categorized or dismissed, it had to be acknowledged. The phrasing deepened. Layers of emotion emerging through subtle variations in touch. Moments of restraint followed by controlled intensity, the kind of contrast that separated performance from artistry, and Emily navigated it effortlessly, as if the boundaries between technique and feeling no longer existed. The audience followed her completely, no shifting in seats, no quiet whispers, only stillness, a shared awareness that this was not simply a recital anymore, it was something else entirely. Something rare. The man in the third row felt his earlier thoughts fade into something heavier, a quiet respect forming in their place. Beside him, the woman's eyes remained fixed on the stage, unblinking, as if afraid that even the smallest distraction might cause her to miss something important. Backstage, the young pianists stood motionless, their expressions no longer guarded, but open, absorbing every note with a focus that bordered on reverence. Victor's breath slowed, his mind no longer searching for explanation, but accepting what was unfolding, the recognition he had been reaching for finally surfaced, subtle at first, then undeniable. The phrasing, the control, the unmistakable signature within the music, it aligned with something he had not heard in years, a name that had once carried weight in every major concert hall, a presence that had vanished without explanation, and now, standing just feet away from him, that presence was returning, not announced, not introduced, but revealed. Emily's hands moved into the final sequence, the most demanding passage of the piece, where precision alone was not enough, where interpretation defined the outcome, and she delivered it with a clarity that left no room for doubt, each note placed with exact intention, each phrase resolved with a quiet authority that did not ask for approval, it commanded it. The energy in the room reached its peak, a tension so complete that even breathing felt deliberate, and then, with a final movement, the music resolved, not abruptly, but with a controlled release, the last note lingering in the air just long enough to be felt before it faded into silence, and in that silence, something shifted, not just in the room, but in every person within it. Because what they had just witnessed could not be undone, could not be explained away. Victor stood frozen, his expression no longer guarded, but exposed, the certainty that had once defined him replaced by something far more honest, recognition, not of a performer, but of a truth he had failed to see. Emily remained still for a moment, her hands resting lightly above the keys, her posture unchanged, as if the performance had not been an effort, but a return, and as the silence stretched just a fraction longer than expected, the room held its breath, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding, because in that moment, words were unnecessary, and judgment, once so quick and effortless, had been replaced by something far more difficult to earn, and impossible to ignore. The silence did not break immediately, it held, stretched thin across the room like something fragile that no one dared to disturb, as if even a single breath taken too soon might shatter what had just been created. Emily remained still at the piano, her hands resting lightly above the keys, not seeking acknowledgement, not turning toward the audience, simply allowing the final note to settle into memory, and then, almost imperceptibly, the shift began. A single pair of hands came together somewhere in the back, hesitant at first, uncertain, followed by another, then another, until the applause rose, not in polite rhythm, but in something fuller, something genuine, a sound that filled the hall with a force that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with recognition. The man in the third row stood slowly, almost without realizing it, his earlier skepticism replaced by something quieter, something humbling. Beside him, the woman rose as well, her expression no longer questioning, but certain. Around them, others followed, the entire audience rising in a wave that carried forward until the room was no longer seated, but standing, united in a response that required no explanation. Backstage, the young pianists exchanged glances that spoke more than words could, their earlier assumptions now distant, replaced by a silent acknowledgement of what they had witnessed, something they could not easily categorize, something that would stay with them long after the night ended. Victor did not move at first, he stood at the edge of the stage, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on Emily, the applause reaching him as if from a distance, his mind still catching up to what his senses had already accepted. The recognition that had surfaced moments earlier now settled fully into place, undeniable, complete. He stepped forward slowly, the movement deliberate, as if each step required him to Leave behind a version of himself that no longer fit, the version that had dismissed, that had reduced, that had assumed, and in its place, something quieter emerged, something far more difficult to hold, humility. He stopped a few feet from the piano, the applause still surrounding them, but now fading into the background of a moment that had become far more personal. Emily finally lifted her gaze, not dramatically, not searching, simply present, her eyes meeting his with a calm that held no accusation, no triumph, only clarity. Victor opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, but no words came, not because there was nothing to say, but because anything he might have said would fall short of what had already been expressed through her music. He inclined his head, just slightly, a gesture so small that many in the audience might have missed it, but for those who understood, it carried weight. It was acknowledgement, it was respect, earned without request, without demand. Emily returned the gesture just as simply, her expression unchanged, as if this exchange, this shift, was not something new, but something inevitable, something that had always been waiting beneath the surface. The applause began to settle, though the energy in the room did not fade. It lingered, quieter now, but deeper, more lasting. Victor stepped back, allowing space where before he had taken control, and in that space, the truth of the moment remained, clear and unchallenged. The quiet woman they had overlooked had not just performed, she had revealed something far greater, and as the final echoes of applause dissolved into silence once more, the room held on to that truth, not as a spectacle, but as a lesson, one that required no explanation, because it had already been understood. The applause did not end when the hands lowered, it lingered in the air, in the way people looked at one another, in the quiet realization that something irreversible had just taken place. And as the audience slowly returned to their seats, the energy in the hall did not return to what it had been before. It had shifted, deeper now, more aware. Victor remained near the edge of the stage, his posture composed but no longer rigid, his gaze following Emily as she stood from the piano bench with the same calm presence she had carried onto the stage. There was no urgency in her movement, no attempt to claim the moment. She simply adjusted the bench with quiet precision, her fingers brushing the polished wood one last time as if closing a chapter only she fully understood. Backstage, the staff who had once moved around her without notice now watched with a different kind of attention, their eyes no longer passing over her, but pausing, recognizing. One of the stage assistants shifted slightly, as if considering speaking, then thought better of it, unsure of what could be said in the presence of something that had already spoken so clearly. The young pianists stood in silence, their earlier confidence replaced by reflection. One of them lowered his gaze briefly, processing not just what he had heard, but what it meant for everything he believed about skill, effort, and recognition. Emily stepped away from the piano and moved toward the wings, her pace unhurried, her expression unchanged, as if the standing ovation had not altered her sense of self, as if she had not been waiting for validation because she had never needed it. Victor watched her approach, the distance between them closing again, but now filled with something entirely different, not authority, not dismissal, but respect that had been earned without request. He spoke quietly this time, his voice measured, stripped of its earlier sharpness. That was not chance, the words simple, but carrying the weight of acknowledgement. Emily paused, her eyes meeting his once more. There was no pride in her expression, no trace of triumph. Only a calm steadiness that made his statement feel less like praise and more like confirmation. No, she replied softly, her voice even, as if the answer had always been obvious. Victor studied her for a brief moment longer, something unspoken passing through his expression, the final piece of recognition settling into place, the name he had searched for earlier now clear in his mind, not announced, not demanded, but understood. And with that understanding came something else, a quiet acceptance of the mistake he had made, not in logistics, not in judgment of skill, but in judgment of presence. He stepped aside, not out of obligation, but choice, creating space where before he had imposed it. Emily inclined her head slightly, a gesture as controlled and effortless as everything else she had done that evening, and continued past him, returning to the quiet shadows of backstage where she had begun. But the space did not feel the same anymore. The invisibility that had once defined her place there had dissolved, replaced by an awareness that could not be undone. The hall behind them began to stir again as the program attempted to resume, but something had changed in the way the audience listened, in the way they watched, every performer who followed would now be measured against a moment they had not expected, and as Emily moved further from the stage lights, her figure blending once more into the quieter corners of the room, the truth of what had happened remained, not in the spotlight, but in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it, because recognition, once awakened, does not easily return to silence. And in that lingering awareness, the quiet woman they had overlooked had already left a mark that no program, no title, and no introduction could ever fully contain. The rest of the evening continued, but it no longer carried the same weight it once had. Each performance that followed was executed with skill, with discipline, with all the elements that had once defined excellence in that hall, yet something intangible had shifted, something that could not be reset or replaced. The audience listened differently now, not just to the notes, but to the presence behind them, measuring not only precision, but authenticity, and in that quiet recalibration, the standard had changed without announcement, without permission. Victor conducted the remainder of the program with his usual control, his gestures exact, his timing flawless, but those who watched closely could sense the difference, a subtle restraint, a thoughtfulness that had not been there before, as if each movement carried the memory of what he had witnessed, and what he had almost dismissed. Backstage, Emily returned to her earlier tasks without ceremony, her hands once again adjusting sheet music, aligning stands, ensuring everything remained in order, the same quiet efficiency, the same understated presence, but now, the space around her responded differently. People moved with a slight awareness when passing her, conversations softened in her proximity, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. One of the younger pianists approached hesitantly, his earlier confidence replaced by something more genuine. He paused a few feet away, uncertain of how to begin, then simply nodded, a small gesture that carried more meaning than words could. Emily acknowledged it with the same calm nod she had given on stage, no more, no less. As the night drew to a close, the audience began to disperse, their conversations no longer centered on the scheduled program, but on a moment that had not been listed, not announced, yet impossible to forget. Names were exchanged, theories offered, fragments of memory recalled, but no single explanation fully captured what they had experienced. Because what had happened was not something that could be neatly defined, Victor remained in the hall longer than usual, standing near the now quiet stage, his gaze resting on the piano that had, for a brief time, revealed something beyond his control. He understood now, not just who Emily was, but what she represented, a reminder that mastery does not always announce itself, that presence does not require recognition to exist, and that judgment, when made too quickly, often reveals more about the observer than the one being observed. He turned slowly, his expression thoughtful, carrying with him a lesson that would not fade easily. Emily finished her final task and prepared to leave, slipping quietly through the same corridor she had walked earlier that evening, her step steady, unhurried, as if nothing about her had changed, and in truth, nothing had. She had not become something new, she had simply allowed what had always been there to be seen. And as she stepped out into the cool night air, the sounds of the hall fading behind her, there was no sense of triumph, no need to linger in the aftermath, only a quiet continuation of the path she had chosen long ago. Inside, the lights dimmed, the stage emptied, but the memory remained, carried not in applause or reputation, but in the quiet understanding that had settled over everyone who had been there. And in that understanding, something simple, something lasting, took root. That respect is not granted by appearance, nor by assumption, but revealed, unmistakably, in the moments when truth is allowed to speak for itself. And on that night, in a hall built for greatness, the world was reminded what dignity looks like.